Hello everyone, welcome to my presentation. For my presentation I chose Fulfilling Our Climate Responsibility. Just for an introduction, I'm Adrian, I'm a third year Sydney student. I chose kind of an environmental climate change focus for mine because of my own kind of concerns, apprehensions, and also personal passions and involvement in volunteering that I do pretty regularly. So I wanted to kind of share my opinion, my stance, and hopefully impart some information and maybe encourage people to get involved a bit. So the premise of my presentation is all about our goals and our fulfillment of our end of the Paris Agreement as a country. So the Paris Agreement, signed in 2016, if anyone wasn't aware here, is all about a ratification to hold the global average temperature increase below 2 degrees below that of pre-industrial norms. So just to explain that, so ever since the Industrial Revolution, World War I, World War II, we have seen huge increases in the global average temperature. 1 to 2 degrees, not a lot, in a vacuum, but when you see wild shifts throughout the world, that is just a culmination of the average. So we are trying to stop that at exceeding 2 degrees from pre-industrial norms, and we are already on track for 1.5. That is the goal of this treaty. It was signed by over 200 UN countries at the time. It's well beyond that now, and now we've actually been able to see how countries have actually followed through. Canada's goal at the time was to have a reduction of 30% of their emissions near that time by 2030, and even then, we probably, you've even seen in recent elections that number has been shifted and has been amended and has been failed to be gotten to. Because right now, at least where we are right now, we should be a lot further along than we currently are. So the basics. So before we go too much further into Canada's responsibilities and what we can do, our government and ourselves, is understanding the basics. And that kind of goes all the way back to the greenhouse effect. A lot of us are familiar with the term or familiar with what climate change is, but I'm going to kind of explain it just for thoroughness. And that is the greenhouse effect being something that is very natural. Every day, our planet orbits the sun, and we take in solar radiation, and much of that radiation from the sun goes right back out into space. But various molecules in our atmosphere, methane, carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxide, fluorocarbons, etc., the greenhouse gases in our atmosphere actually allow some of that sunlight, some of that radiation to be kept within the atmosphere, which is actually what supports life. It allows our atmosphere to retain a certain temperature, to allow water, food, fauna to grow, and is what actually allows life to happen. It's a natural effect. But what's happened now is through all of this human action and also natural action that has essentially inflated and accelerated that natural process to this staggering rate, where now the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere has been so ramped up that instead of only retaining some of that radiation, we retain a lot more. And therefore, that lovely atmosphere that we have gets hotter and hotter. So that natural effect is being bothered artificially and is no longer doing what it used to do. It's retaining too much heat. And with that, it comes down to things like methane production, greenhouse gases, cutting down of trees, which again, all of that carbon that was once sequestered and everything is now coming out and coming out and coming out, just increasing that concentration in our atmosphere. And what happens because of that? We see ocean acidification, sea level rise, flooding, and that leads to more ripple effects and ripple effects. That acidification, that sea level rise leads to species extinction, erasure. That means to people having to relocate, mass refugees. That leads to borders being changed, wars in the future, all kinds of just terrible domino effects that will come. And unfortunately, eventually ending in a world that's not sustainable, or at least a lot of parts of the world. Considering again the parts of the world that are able to produce food, how those will shift over time, and as parts of the world that cannot will actually end up being able to. These are all things that will change. But the main issue is that humanity has evolved in a world at a certain range or certain scale of habitability, and we have not experienced a world at 1.5 or 2 degrees, 2.5 degrees higher than it's going to be. And it's like anything, right? It's like seeing a study on smoking. People can smoke, but it's not until we've seen a lifelong study on a smoker that we can really truly see what that consequence is. And we're yet to see what the consequences of climate change will be by the year 2050, 2100, and so forth. So we're going to go back to the actual Paris Accord now and talk about what it is and what it actually signifies. And on paper, it's a great piece of legislation. It's a binding contract for countries to all strive to achieve results so we can keep this increase under control. But sadly, it lacks any real enforcement. Countries have all signed and written down various proclamations and various reductions they're going to strive towards, especially that being of China, the United States, the EU, countries that are the bigger contributors to emissions in general. But all of these are just, again, claims. There is no penalty, no enforcement of these goals if they are or not achieved. And sadly, even now, looking at the Accord 5 years later, 6 years later, only about 10 of the countries have actually are on track to their goals. Some have even exceeded them. Some have actually already met their goals. But that's a sad number compared to the overall 200, us included, by far, unfortunately. So if the Accord itself can't hold countries responsible, who can? Is it the government? Is it the people? Well, I think the government, like anything else, is a key pillar, is a key player in that regard. The government can offer support. It can offer subsidies, grants, funding to offset a lot of the pre-existing things we have in our country, whether that's companies like Enbridge and any one of the pre-existing fossil fuel industries that are already here. They can aid with offsetting up-and-coming sustainable companies with subsidies, with help to allow us, the people, to make that transition. Because as of right now, most things that are sustainable are great in theory, but come with a big upfront cost. For someone to go and buy an electric car or get paneling for their housing, all these things are big investments. To go and buy that or organic meat from the grocery store or something alternative, buying oil products, buying cheap products, buying disposable products is cheaper. So for your average person, it is more difficult. So governments can help in that regard. They can offset the price of carbon. They can steer people in that direction, but that only goes so far. It is still on us to make a change, and we should. Whether it's small or large, gradual or immediate, we can make that change. So the rest of the slides here are more me kind of talking to you guys individually or one-on-one of just some things that you can do. And I think we all know the big steps. That can be something as small as swapping out your plastic bags for some reusable ones, trying to reduce a bit of the meat in your diet and so forth. And it can also be much, much bigger steps, like saving up towards an electric vehicle or paneling for your home or re-insulating for a better heat economy and so forth. But it's also about the consumerism, potentially even just using an old car till it dies rather than buying a new one, getting rid of your clothes and dropping them off at a Salvation Army or a Value Village rather than buying new ones or throwing them away. Just being cognizant about your consumption, about your own footprint, where everything in your life that you use, where its footprint comes from. And again, that goes back to sites you use, companies you buy from, how you vote, how you eat, and so forth. So those are all kind of individual actions. And then finally add some elements about getting involved. And this is something that I'm involved in here at the school. This is the Mission Zero program. It's been a bit different, obviously, the past year with people not being on campus very much. But if anyone's interested, these are things that go on throughout the regular year. We do the wildflower garden and planting on campus. There's also plenty of events that happen outside of campus. That's shore cleanups, park cleanups, just get-togethers. It's a lot of things you can get involved in. Mission Zero, it's a site off the Sheridan website. You can get there right from Sheridan.com. There's a link to it from there, and even right here. And then things in your area. I'm personally involved in the Oakville Green organization that's here near campus. And there's plenty of them nearby, Burlington, Mississauga, and so forth. Groups you can go to get involved, do some work, meet some really nice people, and learn a lot. I myself don't claim to be an expert by any means, so take what you will with a grain of salt, but I have met so many lovely people doing things like this and getting involved, and it's very gratifying work, and you meet people who are even more educated on the subject. And once you get down that rabbit hole, it is it's a good one to get lost in. I'll leave it there, everyone. Thanks for your time. If we can maybe talk a bit and ask some questions and share. But I'd love to share my experience and even invite you guys to join at some point. And also, hopefully, kind of maybe if you didn't already know a bit about the Paris Accord and Canada's involvement, now you can know a bit. So when next election happens, or so on and so forth, you know a bit about what we're trying to achieve and what our leaders are, their goals are compared to your own. So maybe that may match up, or maybe it won't. So let that kind of maybe be something to think about. Do your own personal goals and viewpoints line up with what our leaders are? And if they do or they don't, what can you do about it yourself? And hopefully hear some things, if you didn't already know, that you can't do. Take care.